What's going on, gardeners? It's Sunday, July 17th, and it is time to begin turning our crops over here on the southeastern coast of North Carolina. And in today's video, we are going to put no-till gardening to the test, and we are going to figure out, does it work and is it worth doing for most backyard gardeners? If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon storefront and spread shop in the video description for a list of the gardening products I use and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated. The bulk of my spring crops are starting to get very beat up here where I live, and it's about now that I like to start going through my garden and ripping out all of the old spring crops and then getting the soil ready for a second planting for my fall garden. So normally I go through all my beds, I rip out all the old plants, I shake the soil off, and then I get rid of the old plants and throw them in the compost pile. But this time I'm going to try something new. I'm going to try it the no-till way. And the no-till method of garden says this. It says that the health of your soil and your microbiome, all of the worms and bacteria and fungi that grow in that soil, is the most important part of your garden, and you need to maintain your soil health at all costs. So when you normally go through and you rip out plants and you pull those roots up, or you go and you till your soil, you actually disturb that microbiome and you damage it, and then it has to spend the rest of the season recovering. So till gardening is actually not good for your soil health. Rather, instead, you're going to come in with a pair of pruning shears and you are going to snip off all of the old stalks down flush with your garden soil, and you're simply going to let those roots decompose. Then later you're just going to throw some organic fertilizer on top, and you're going to throw some compost, maybe some mulch. You're not going to till anything, and you're going to let your bed sit. And the theory says that because you didn't disturb your soil microbiome, it's going to thrive, and it's going to eat all those old roots, it's going to eat up the compost, any mulch, and it's going to be faster at recovering because you didn't till and disturb and damage that soil microbiome. As an engineer whose business is in science and logic, that to me sounds like a very reasonable hypothesis. However, even if we were to run a controlled experiment and our conclusions supported that hypothesis, it doesn't matter if you can't properly implement it into your garden. If I designed a car that ran for free on Martian air, it doesn't mean anything if I can't get to Mars to use the car. So what do I mean by this? No-till gardening says that we have to let the roots of our old plants sit in the soil over time and break down and decompose. And that's all well and good if you only grow food during the summer, and then come October and November, you just give up on your garden and you don't come back until next spring, and you have all of that time for the roots to decompose. Or maybe you have a large enough garden where you're able to let entire beds rest for months at a time. But what do people like me do that have a relatively small garden in a simple, average suburban plot? And I like to grow things all year round, 365 days a year. What if I don't have the ability to simply let those roots break down for months at a time? What if I need to use that bed in 3 or 4 weeks after I pull all my old crops out? And up to this point, that's why I haven't given no-till gardening a chance. I just don't have time to relax my beds for months on end because I'm always growing something. Here I have my old bed where I was growing sweet corn, and I just got rid of all the old plants last week, so this bed has only been sitting for barely a week. And I had to start new corn transplants, which you can see right here. I'm growing them from transplant because I actually had a better luck growing from transplant than I did directly from seed in an experiment that I ran. So these transplants are going to be ready to go in this bed in a few days, and I just don't have anywhere else to put them. However, you don't know what you don't know, and it isn't fair for me to just blanketly assume that no-till gardening can't be used with fairly rapid bed turnover. So this is the perfect time for me to run an experiment, and here is what I'm going to do. Instead of going in and ripping out all of the corn stalks by the roots, I went through with a pair of pruning shears and I cut them all down flush with the surface of the soil. And you can see all of the leftover corn stalks sticking up about an inch or so from the top of the mulch layer, and the roots are still intact underneath. There was no tilling done with the soil. Here are all the corn stalks that I cut down last week with my pruning shears. I'm simply going to take all of these and I'm going to use them as mulch around my fruit trees in the back because they make a really good mulch to snuff out weeds and provide nutrients back to your trees. However, one thing that is important is if you're going to use your old corn stalks as mulch, make sure that you remove any leftover ears of corn that you did not harvest, because they will sprout on you just like this leftover ear is. So make sure that you get rid of these and either throw them out or compost them, because you don't want little corn plants sprouting underneath all of your fruit trees or wherever you're using your corn stalks as mulch. And here's the experiment that I'm going to run. I'm going to remove the corn stalks down to the roots and rip them out and shake off the soil like I normally do on the first 2 rows that run this way in my bed. And I'm not going to do it to the other ones. And then when I place my corn transplants, we are going to see if there is any difference on either side of the bed and which grow better, if at all. And that will tell us if no-till gardening actually works in the short term, or if me leaving the roots in here in the short term will actually choke out my new transplants. So if no-till gardening doesn't work in the short term, these roots will not decompose fast enough on this side of the bed and actually snuff out my seedlings, and they won't do as well as they will on the side of the bed that I did disturb. If there is no difference, or if the no-till side performs better, that says a lot about the no-till gardening, because if it even matches the side where I rip everything up, then that basically means no-till. The roots decompose so quickly that you can do this over a matter of weeks, and there's no reason why anybody can't be using no-till. So I think we will learn a lot from this experiment. And the one thing that you'll notice is I said I'm going to rip out the roots in this direction. That's because the sun is over there. So if I ripped it out in this direction, this corn would get more sunlight than the corn over there. That's because this pepper row right here will in effect shade out the back row of corn. And that just wouldn't be fair. So because the sun moves like this, that's why we're going to rip it out from this side. That way everything gets equal amounts of sun and there is no cheating. So we're going to start by pulling out the corn roots in the first couple rows, and you'll see right here, this is a stalk of corn that I already cut down. So let's move this drip line out of the way. And I'm going to pull out this corn root because I want to show you just how big the roots of corn are and how much it can disturb the soil. So that right there is the corn root. So if you were to simply rip them out, that is basically the amount of damage that you're going to cause to your soil every time. And you can see there are things like grubs in there. There are all kinds of things going to town trying to eat those old roots. So because they've been sitting here for a week, they've actually noticeably decomposed. So I'm already a little bit optimistic here. So we're going to go through and we're going to remove the corn stalk roots from the first 2 vertical rows. And these are all the corn roots that I pulled out of those first 2 rows. And I'm actually surprised how small the root mass is. I thought it would be bigger because I did pull one out day 1, and it took basically the whole mass of my soil all the way down to the bottom of my raised beds with it. So they've already decomposed quite a bit. So pretty impressed to see that. I'm cautiously optimistic. Then we're going to come back in a few days when our corn seedlings are ready for transplant. Well, it's July 23rd and I got all of my new corn seedlings in, and they look fantastic. Now, as I previously mentioned, those 2 rows up in the front, they had all of the roots of the old corn plants ripped out, whereas these 3 rows in the back, I left all of the corn roots in. So we'll see if they obstruct the growth rate of this corn at all, or if it does absolutely nothing and they both grow equivalently, or maybe even the corn in the back will grow even better. I just don't know what to expect. So we're going to run this experiment and we're going to let it go for several weeks, maybe even a month or 2, and we will see if we notice any difference in how the corn grows. It's Thursday, September 22nd, and it's been a total of 67 days since I initially cleared my beds and 61 days since I transplanted my corn transplants. So we can now gauge and compare how well the corn transplants did in the no-dig side of the bed versus the dig side of the bed, and see if there was any difference at all. Now, before I show you the difference in results, I want you to be aware that all of the corn that I'm about to show you is absolutely pathetic looking. Overall, everything did very poorly, and I learned a very valuable lesson during this experiment. If you live in the Carolinas or South, do not transplant your corn in the middle of July. It is way too hot. So all of my corn suffered due to the heat stress. Next year I'll plant my fall corn in mid-August once things finally start cooling down and we're on the downslope for an October harvest. I was too aggressive with my planting dates. But the experiment is still very valuable because you will be able to see the differences in planting and how the dig versus the no dig section performed. Now before I show you my corn in my dig and no dig experimental bed, I made sure I planted a few ears of corn in these old beds that I had tomatoes growing in earlier in the season. Now these beds are my control beds because the tomatoes that were placed inside these beds were ripped out an entire month before I planted any of these corn transplants in there, and those beds had a long time to hang out and settle down. So I knew I would get the best experience in these beds because the beds had been resting for a while. So I have a few ears of corn here that have come to fruition. So let's see how they look. Now, while I do have a little bit of insect damage on these ears of corn, which you expect when you're growing organic corn, as I've grown, overall, they look very good. I mean, check that out. Really perfectly fully formed ears, and if it weren't for that little bit of bug damage, I would have had pretty much 100% pollination. So, despite the fact that these plants look absolutely terrible, the ears of corn they're producing really good, and I think it's not just a fluke. This ear of corn is basically identical right here. While I do have, once again, a little bit of pest damage up at the top, the actual ear itself, the kernels, they're absolutely beautiful. So very successful despite the ugly look. Now let's see how the dig and no dig experimental bed went. Now this right here is the experiment dig no dig bed, and what you're looking at right here is the dig side where I pulled out all of the existing roots before I transplanted. And while everything overall looks bad, this side is clearly the winner. And I do have, despite the ugly plants, some decent ears of corn that have formed on this side. Nothing amazing by any stretch of the imagination, definitely inferior to the control plants, but there is something to be had here, and I do have a few ears of corn. When I go to the other side, and I show you the side where I left the roots in the ground, a lot of these plants are very stunted, very small. Some of them did not even produce any ears. So I really don't have any ears of corn on this side of the bed. And it could be for a few reasons. It could be because for a couple of weeks I had a shade cloth that was up here, and maybe the shade cloth provided more shade to the back than the front, and maybe that harmed the plants in the back. But I would think that would actually benefit them because they may have gotten a little bit more shade, and it was just brutal here in late July and August. But I digress. There is definitely a big difference in the performance of the plants. So what I'm going to do is I will harvest an ear of corn off of the side where I did pull all the roots out, because that's the only side that I actually have ears of corn that I can harvest. So this ear of corn right here is from the side where I did pull out the roots, and oof, had a lot of pest damage on this one. But despite all the pest damage at the top, the actual kernels at the bottom look pretty good. It's just a very small ear of corn. Let's see how this one turned out. And once again, a lot of pest damage at the top. I probably should have sprayed more spinosad, but really great kernel development at the bottom. One of the ears in the middle kind of split the bed between the dig and the no dig side. So this is the closest thing to an ear of corn that I can actually test on the dig side, on the no dig side. So once again, pretty decent ear development or kernel development. Looks like I had maybe some pollination issues over here. So the moral of the story is, don't plant your corn transplants in July if you live in the hot South. Now that being said, I think it's a really good idea that we actually look around the ground and try and find some of the old corn stalks where I didn't pull the roots out. And here I actually see one right here. This is the old corn stalk, and we can try and gauge what the roots look like right now. So this was after 67 days. This is how much root mass is left. I did not obviously pull them out. So there's still this much root mass left over from the old corn stalks after over 2 months sitting in ground. It's pretty clear to me that if you're going to practice the no-dig method, where you're not going to rip out your old roots because you don't want to disturb the soil, you can't just change your bed over in a week or two like I did. You really need to give them probably about 2 or 3 months, maybe longer, for things to really break down. Because again, there's still this much root mass left over, kind of as an obstacle for your plants that can seriously impact them and choke them off. So while I do think this is a really valid method of gardening, you have to be a lot more patient than I am with this method. If you're just going to go ahead and turn your beds over very, very quickly, you probably want to rip your roots out. If you have the ability to wait 3 or 4 months in between plantings and you can really let your beds rest, this is probably a great way of gardening, because not only is it probably better for the bacteria and the fungi in the soil to not be disturbed, but you're adding all of this organic matter decomposing back into your garden soil. So that is clearly a good thing. But this is for the patient gardener, the gardener that has time to allow the beds to rest, the gardener that has enough room in their garden where they can spare the space to let them rest. For rapid bed turnover, I'll probably stick with my typical method, where I basically pull out all of the roots, I top dress everything with kitchen scraps and compost, and then I tarp everything and let it sit for about 30 days or so to really break down. I tend to get better results doing that. And that right there is my honest assessment of this little dig versus no dig experiment that I put together. Now, I know that this is not a perfect experiment. I know that I messed up planting my corn at the wrong time of the year. I know that the shade cloth that I put up above the corn stalks for a couple of weeks may have been a variable that I did not account for. But that being said, the results were clear in terms of high intensity gardening with rapid bed turnover. If you are going to rapidly turn over your beds, where you pull out the old crop and you put in a new crop within a couple of weeks of each other, it is clearly better to pull the roots out, because they clearly constricted the root system of my corn plants and they stunted their growth. That being said, if you have more time and you can afford to wait 3 months or so in between beds, I think that no-dig method makes a lot of sense to let all of those roots break down and refeed the soil. So take this experiment for what it's worth. I thought it would be a fun and interesting experiment to run, and while I was a little bit disappointed with the results are what they are, and that is my honest assessment. So everybody, I sure hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you're notified when we release more videos like these. If you're curious about any of the products that I use for real in my garden, they are all linked down in my Amazon storefront link in the video description, so click that link for everything I use in real life, and while you're there, check out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Daddy.
Thank you for singing. You want to blow out the candles on the chocolate cake? No, no, no. I wish for my birthday that Dale doesn't get any chocolate. That's my birthday wish.
Scaly has a treat up there, though.
Oh, he's got his own treat.
That's right.
Go on your bed. We'll give you a treat. Good boy.